It was 6:42 in the morning, and from my kitchen window I watched them prepare for the party. A catering truck was parked on the newly laid asphalt of the circular driveway, its rear doors open, disgorging stainless steel trays and chafing dishes. Men in white shirts were arranging tables and chairs on the expansive flagstone patio, their movements efficient and practiced. In the center of it all, gleaming in the early September sun, stood the Lakeside Vistas Community Clubhouse, a monument to ambition, poor planning, and what would soon become a catastrophic legal miscalculation. It was a $3 million mistake, and it was sitting squarely on my land. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The coffee was black. The morning was quiet, and the folder on my kitchen table was 2 inches thick. An hour later, she arrived. Brenda McAllister, president of the Homeowners Association, conductor of this grand symphony of misappropriation. She wore a tailored pantsuit the color of a flamingo and shoes with heels sharp enough to aerate a lawn. She moved among the workers with an air of proprietary command, pointing, gesturing, her voice a shrill counterpoint to the low hum of preparation. I watched her direct 2 men as they struggled with a large silk-draped banner that read, "Lakeside Vistas, a New Era." They were trying to affix it to 2 newly planted ornamental trees that had been sunk into my soil without my permission just last Tuesday. I had the receipt for the arborist's consultation on my desk. Eventually, her gaze swept across the manicured HOA mandated lawns and settled on my property line, an unruly demarcation where my meadow met their perfect turf. And then she saw me, standing on my porch, coffee mug in hand, watching. Her smile, which had been plastered on for the benefit of the catering staff, tightened into a thin, dismissive line. She started walking towards me, her sharp heels sinking slightly into the sod, a determined little divot with every step. I didn't move. I just waited. "Well, good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with the sort of saccharine condescension she reserved for those she considered obstacles. She stopped just short of my property line, a line she fundamentally did not understand. Big day for the community, a very big day. I said nothing. I just looked at her, then at the clubhouse behind her, a sprawling 2-story structure of wood, stone, and glass. It had a fitness center, a banquet hall, and an infinity pool that was, at that very moment, being filled by a water truck. I had a copy of the pool contractor's invoice in my folder. It was addressed to the HOA, but the work had been performed on Parcel 7B, my parcel. "I do hope," she continued, gesturing vaguely towards my house, "that with the new clubhouse finally finished, you'll be inspired to do something about this." She waved a dismissive hand at my land. My land was mostly meadow, dotted with old-growth oaks. It was not manicured, it was not tidy, it was exactly as my late wife Eleanor had loved it. The view from the second-floor veranda is just spectacular, but it's rather spoiled by that overgrown fence line of yours. We'll be sending out a notice, of course. There are standards to maintain, especially now. She was threatening to fine me for the state of my own property, from a building illegally constructed on that same property. The irony was so dense it was practically a physical object. I could feel the weight of it in the air between us. I took another sip of coffee. "This clubhouse is a testament to what we can achieve when we work together for the common good," she said, puffing out her chest slightly. "It took vision. It took strength. Some people lack that vision. They can't see beyond their own selfish interests." This was her rehearsed speech, the one she'd probably give at the ribbon-cutting ceremony in a few hours. She was practicing on me. I was the selfish interest, the dragon that had to be slain for her to build her castle. I finally lowered my mug. I looked at her, at the crisp flamingo suit, at the unwavering confidence in her eyes. It was a confidence born not of knowledge or right, but of a profound, almost religious belief in her own entitlement. She genuinely believed that her desires constituted a form of law. She had no idea who she was talking to, what I did for a living, or what was sitting in the plain manila folder on my kitchen table. She had no idea that every permit she had filed, every contractor she had hired, every shovelful of my earth she had displaced, had been documented, catalogued, and prepared as an exhibit. She had no idea that the grand opening she was so meticulously planning was not the beginning of her new era, but the grand finale of her ruin. But before I tell you what I did next, before I describe the precise moment the foundation of her world turned to sand, I should probably explain how we got here. It didn't start with a clubhouse. It started, as these things often do, with something much smaller. It started with a bird feeder. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 68 years old, and for 45 of those years I was a licensed land surveyor and civil engineer. I am, by nature and by trade, a man of lines, of boundaries, of clearly defined and legally defensible truths. My work was to translate the abstract language of deeds and plats into the physical reality of steel pins driven into the ground. A surveyor's benchmark is a point of absolute certainty in a chaotic world. You can argue about politics, about religion, about art. You cannot argue about a geodetic control point tied to the National Spatial Reference System. It simply is. I find great comfort in that. I am a widower. My wife, Eleanor, passed away 6 years ago. We bought this land, all 40 acres of it, when we were young and foolish and deeply in love. It was an old farmstead, neglected and overgrown, but Eleanor saw what it could be. We built our small house with our own hands, right on the spot where the old farmhouse had stood. The surrounding land was sold off to a developer who carved it up into the quarter-acre lots that would become lakeside vistas. We kept our 40 acres, a quiet island in a rising sea of suburbia. Eleanor was a botanist, and this land was her sanctuary, her laboratory, her life's work. She knew every tree, every wild flower, every seasonal creek. She would have been horrified by the clubhouse, not just for the trespass, but for the sheer vulgarity of it. After she was gone, the house became very quiet. My work had always been my passion, but now it became my refuge. I took on smaller jobs, consultations mostly, enjoying the methodical process without the pressure of running a large firm. I lived a simple, orderly life. I read, I gardened, I maintained the property in the slightly wild way Eleanor had preferred, and I kept to myself. Brenda McAllister became HOA president about 3 years ago. Her campaign, I was told, was run on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing the covenants. What this meant in practice was a reign of petty tyranny. She was a woman who had never, I suspect, been given any real authority in her life, and so she wielded the microscopic power of an HOA presidency like a scepter. Mailboxes had to be a specific shade of black, RAL 9005, jet black, to be precise. Holiday decorations could be displayed for a period not to exceed 21 days. Trash receptacles could not be visible from the street except on designated collection days. Violations were met with sternly worded letters, followed by fines that escalated with breathtaking speed. My first direct interaction with her was over a bird feeder Eleanor had hung from the branch of an ancient oak tree near our property line. I received a notice in the mail, printed on cheap letterhead bearing a clip art image of a generic Tuscan villa. It informed me that my avian feeding station was in violation of Bylaw 17, Section C, which prohibited structures visible from the common areas that were not approved by the Architectural Review Committee. It was absurd. The feeder was 100 yards from the nearest neighboring house and had been there for 20 years. My first instinct was to ignore it. My property was not part of the HOA. I was not subject to their bylaws. This was a simple, indisputable fact. I could have written a letter explaining this, citing my deed and the original development plat. It would have taken me 10 minutes. But something stayed my hand. I had heard stories from my neighbors, the ones who lived within the borders of her little kingdom. Stories of lanes placed on homes for unpaid fines over lawn gnomes, of endless harassment over trivial matters. I realized that responding with logic to an illogical person was a fool's errand. It would only invite a protracted, draining argument. She didn't want to be right. She wanted to win. So I chose a different path. I took down the bird feeder, and I wrote a check for the $25 fine. I mailed it to the HOA's post office box. A week later, I received a receipt. I took the original notice, a copy of my check, and the receipt, and I clipped them together. I went to my office, took out a clean manila folder, and wrote one word on the tab in my neat block lettering, McAllister. I placed the papers inside. This was the beginning of my paper trail. On paper, I was a compliant, if slightly negligent, homeowner. On paper, I was acknowledging their authority. I kept the receipts. Over the next 2 years, the folder grew. A notice about the length of the grass in my meadow near the road. I paid the $50 fine. A warning that the paint on my fence was flaking, though the fence was on my property and deliberately weathered. I paid the $75 fine. Each time I did not argue, I did not complain, I simply paid, and I filed the paperwork. I was creating a record. It was a slow, patient process, like setting survey markers for a legal boundary that wasn't yet visible. I started attending the monthly HOA meetings. They were held on Zoom, a concession to modernity that Brenda seemed to resent. I never turned on my camera or my microphone. I was just a name in a list of attendees. I listened. I listened as she berated a young couple for planting a vegetable garden in their backyard because it was unsightly. I listened as she unilaterally denied a family's request to build a wheelchair ramp for their elderly mother because it didn't match the aesthetic character of the neighborhood. And I listened as she first floated the idea of the new clubhouse. She spoke of it in glowing terms. A jewel for the community. A place for gatherings, for fitness, for enhancing our shared lifestyle. She presented a preliminary sketch. It was a grandiose affair, far too large for a community of our size, and I noticed, with a surveyor's eye for spatial relationships, that the proposed location on her little map seemed to bleed over the established property line into my land. At the time, I dismissed it as a crude drawing, a conceptual error. I underestimated her audacity. The first tangible sign of trouble was a series of small, wooden stakes with orange flags, driven into the ground about 50 yards inside my property line. They appeared one Tuesday morning. I walked out to them, my boots damp with dew. I pulled my handheld GPS rover from my workshop, a professional-grade Trimble unit, accurate to within a centimeter. I took a reading from the corner stake. I walked back to my office and pulled up the digital plat map of my property, registered with the county recorder's office. The coordinates matched a point deep within my parcel, 7B. The stakes weren't just a little over the line. They were carving out a 2-acre chunk of my meadow. This was no longer about bird feeders. This was a declaration. This was an invasion. But anger is a poor tool for this kind of work. Anger is imprecise. I prefer a T-square and a sharp pencil. I didn't pull up the stakes. I photographed them, logged their GPS coordinates, and left them exactly where they were. They were evidence. My next step was the formal warning. This is a critical part of the process. You must be able to demonstrate that you made a good faith effort to resolve the issue peacefully. I composed a letter. It was polite, professional, and unambiguous. It stated that the recent survey markers placed on my property, Parcel 7B, were in error and constituted a trespass. I included a certified copy of my deed, a printout of the official county plat map with my property clearly delineated, and my professional opinion as a licensed surveyor that their proposed construction site was located on my private land. I suggested they conduct a proper boundary survey before proceeding. I sent it via certified mail, return receipt requested, to the HOA's official address, with a specific, attention, Brenda McAllister, President. 10 days later, the envelope came back to me. Scrawled across the front in angry red ink were 2 words, return to sender. The green return receipt card was still attached, but the signature line was blank. The box for refused was checked. She hadn't even opened it. She had seen my name and sent it back, a deliberate act of willful ignorance. I didn't get angry. I took the unopened, refused envelope, placed it in a clear plastic sleeve, and added it to the McAllister folder. It was, in its own way, more damning than a signature would have been. I followed up with an email, attaching digital copies of the same documents. I used a service that tracks when the email is opened. I received the notification the next morning at 9:14 a.m. Your email to bmcallister.lakesidehoa@email.com was opened. There was no reply. The lack of reply was, itself, a form of communication. It said, "I have received your evidence and I have chosen to ignore it." I printed the email, the attachments, and the read receipt, and I filed them. The warning had been issued and officially ignored. My duty to be neighborly was concluded. My duty to protect my property had begun. I closed the door to my office, sat down at my large drafting table, and got to work. My first call was to Jean, my old paralegal. Jean is a bloodhound who thrives in the dusty archives of county courthouses. He's forgotten more about title searches and property law than most lawyers ever learn. I gave him the parcel numbers for my land, and for all the adjacent HOA common areas. I told him to pull everything: deeds, easements, covenants, liens, minutes from the original developers' planning meetings in the 1980s. "I want the entire history of this land, Jean," I told him. "I want to know every promise that was ever made on paper and every one that was ever broken." While Jean dug into the past, I focused on the present. I purchased 3 high-resolution, cellular-enabled trail cameras. I mounted them discreetly on trees, camouflaged and positioned to provide a complete view of the disputed 2 acres. They were motion-activated and uploaded their footage directly to a secure cloud server. From my desk, I could now watch a live feed of the invasion. The first videos came in a few days later. A bulldozer arrived, scraping away the meadow grass Eleanor had so carefully cultivated. I watched the blade dig into the earth, my earth, and felt a cold, quiet resolve settle over me. I saved the video file, labeled it with a date and time, and created a new subfolder on my computer: Documented Trespass. Every day brought a new violation. Concrete trucks arrived to pour the foundation. Framers began to erect the skeleton of the building. I didn't watch it all. I didn't need to. I just saved the daily summary files. The slow, methodical construction of their clubhouse was also the slow, methodical construction of my legal case. Each nail they drove was another piece of my evidence. They were building my victory for me, and they were paying for it themselves. About 2 weeks into this process, Gene called. His voice was different. It had the quiet excitement of a historian who has just found a missing document. "Arthur," he said, "you're not going to believe this. I found it. I found their original sin." He explained. Back in 1988, when the developer was first laying out the infrastructure for Lakeside Vistas, he needed to run a main water line to the subdivision. The most direct route cut across a corner of my family's farm, the parcel I now owned. The developer signed a formal agreement with my father. It was a utility easement, a common legal instrument that grants limited use of a property for a specific purpose. In this case, it allowed the developer to bury the water main. But my father, a shrewd man who trusted contracts more than handshakes, had insisted on a specific clause. Gene read it to me over the phone. "This easement shall remain in effect for the sole purpose of providing primary water service to the Lakeside Vistas development during its initial construction phase, and shall be automatically terminated, null and void, upon the successful connection of said development to the municipal water system of the county of Northwood." I knew what that meant. The development had been connected to the county water main in 1993. I remembered it happening. The easement had expired almost 30 years ago. It was a ghost on the property records. "Here's the kicker, Arthur," Jean said. The HOA's governing documents, the ones filed when the developer handed over control, reference a common area, access and utility easement on the border of your property. They have a record of the easement's creation. What they don't have, or what they've never bothered to read, is the original document itself, with the termination clause. This was the bombshell. This was the faulty premise upon which Brenda had built her entire enterprise. For 30 years, the HOA had operated under the mistaken belief that they had a right to that strip of land. It was a piece of community folklore that had hardened into accepted fact, a story they told themselves so often they forgot to check if it was true. Brenda hadn't just decided to take my land. She believed, in her own profoundly incurious way, that it was already hers. Her aggression was rooted in a generation of clerical error and intellectual laziness. She had no idea she was trespassing on a foundation of lies. I had Jean send me a certified copy of the original easement agreement from the county archives. When it arrived, I held the brittle paper in my hands. My father's signature was at the bottom, firm and clear. It felt like a message from the past, a final act of a father's foresight protecting his son. I placed it in the folder. It was Exhibit A. The construction continued through the spring and into the summer. The building took shape, a monument to Brenda's hubris. I continued to document everything. I did not set foot on the construction site. I did not speak to the workers. I was a ghost, watching from a distance. One afternoon, I was walking my own fence line, a good 100 feet from their activity, checking for damage from the heavy trucks that were now using an old farm track on my property as an unofficial access road. Brenda saw me from the patio of the half-finished clubhouse. She must have had me on speed dial, because within 15 minutes, a sheriff's department cruiser was rolling down my driveway. A young deputy got out, looking uncomfortable. He was polite, but firm. "Sir, I've had a complaint about you harassing the construction crew." Brenda was right behind him, standing with her arms crossed, a smug look on her face. This was her power play. This was the state in the form of this young deputy, validating her authority. "Harassing them?" I asked calmly. "I haven't spoken a word to anyone." "She says you were glaring at them, trying to intimidate them," the deputy said, clearly just reciting what he'd been told. Brenda stepped forward. "He's been a problem from the start, officer. A disgruntled old man trying to stand in the way of progress. This is all HOA, common property, and he's been acting like he owns the place. We need him officially warned to stay away." The deputy turned to me. "Sir, is this your property?" I nodded. "It is." I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet. From it I produced my driver's license and a neatly folded, laminated copy of my deed's title page, which I always carried. I handed them to him. "My name is Arthur Vance. This is my land parcel 7B. The individuals over there," I said, gesturing to the construction site, "are the ones who are trespassing. I am here inspecting my fence for damages caused by their vehicles." The deputy looked from my documents to Brenda. His expression shifted subtly. The professional mask was still in place, but a flicker of doubt, of re-evaluation, crossed his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, turning to Brenda, "do you have any paperwork showing this land belongs to the HOA?" Brenda sputtered. "It's in the covenants, it's common area. I don't carry the bylaws around with me, officer." "This gentleman has a deed," the deputy said, his tone flat. "That's a pretty strong document." "He's trying to confuse you with technicalities," she insisted. The deputy handed my documents back to me. "It sounds like this is a civil matter, sir, ma'am. I can't ask him to leave his own property." He then turned to me. "Do you want me to ask the construction crew to leave?" This was the moment. I could have brought the whole thing to a halt right there. I could have had them all removed for trespassing. But the building wasn't finished. The damages weren't complete. The trap was not yet fully built. "No, deputy, not today," I said. "But I would like to make a formal statement for your report. Please note that as of this date and time, I have officially informed the Lakeside Vistas HOA through its president Brenda McAllister, in your presence, that their construction is taking place on my private property, and that they and their contractors are trespassing. I want that on the record." The deputy's eyes met mine. I think he understood then. This was not a simple neighborhood squabble. This was something else. He nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He took out his notepad and began to write. Brenda watched, her mouth agape, her power play collapsing in on itself. The authority she had summoned was now dutifully recording my version of events, not hers. When he was done, he gave me an incident number. I thanked him. He got in his car and drove away. I took the small slip of paper with the incident number, went back to my house and filed it, another brick in the wall of my case. The confrontation with the deputy, as it turned out, had been witnessed. That evening, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was my neighbor, George Henderson. George was a retired postman, a quiet man, who had lived in Lakeside Vistas for 30 years. He was also one of Brenda's favorite targets. He'd been fined for the color of his garden shed, the height of his sunflowers, and for leaving his garden hose coiled in a way that Brenda deemed unaesthetic. He stood on my porch, twisting a worn baseball cap in his hands. "Arthur," he said, his voice low, "I saw what happened today, with the sheriff. Good for you. Someone's got to stand up to that woman." I invited him in. He sat at my kitchen table, the one where the McAllister folder now lived. He told me about the endless stream of fines, the constant feeling of being watched and judged. He told me he was thinking of selling, of moving away from the home he'd lived in for 3 decades, just to escape her. "She's a bully," he said, his voice trembling slightly with a mixture of anger and fear. "And the rest of the board, they just go along with her. They're scared of her too." Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB flash drive. "I don't know if this will help," he said, pushing it across the table. "I started recording the audio of the Zoom meetings a while back, just for my own records, just in case." He told me about a specific meeting, the one where the board voted to approve the final construction budget for the clubhouse. "She knew the property line was an issue," George said. "I remember it clear as day. Someone asked if they'd had a new survey done." Brenda laughed it off. She said, "And I'll never forget this," she said. "The boundary is a little fuzzy, but that old man Vance won't do anything. It's better to build first and ask for forgiveness later. He'll never have the money to fight us." I took the flash drive. "Thank you, George," I said. "This is more helpful than you can imagine." He had just handed me proof of intent. Her own words, proving she knew there was a risk and chose to proceed anyway. It was malice, pure and simple. A few days later I received an email from an anonymous address. The subject line was Clubhouse Financials. The sender was a board member who had grown a conscience. It was Sarah, a retired accountant who had been on the board for a year. The email was brief. "I voted against this. She wouldn't listen. This is wrong. Use these as you see fit." Attached were the HOA's internal financial statements, the loan documents for the clubhouse, and the minutes from several closed-door board meetings. The documents painted a horrifying picture of fiscal mismanagement. Brenda had secured a $3 million construction loan from a private lender at an exorbitant interest rate. She had done it without a full vote of the homeowners, using a loophole in the bylaws. The loan was collateralized by the future clubhouse itself. The bank had a lien on a building that was being constructed on land the HOA did not own. They had accepted the HOA's fraudulent claim of ownership based on that 30-year-old expired easement. The entire financial structure of the project was a house of cards, built on my meadow. I now had a fearful ally in George and a disillusioned insider in Sarah. The community wasn't a monolith. It was a collection of individuals, many of whom were just as much Brenda's victims as I was. I was no longer just fighting for my land. I was fighting for them, too. With the grand opening just a week away, Brenda made her final, over-the-top move. A certified letter arrived. Not refused this time. Inside was a special assessment invoice for $5,000. It was addressed to me. The charges were itemized: landscaping beautification, view corridor improvement, and, most gallingly, nuisance tree removal. I walked out to the edge of my property, near where the new clubhouse patio offered its spectacular view. There was a fresh, raw stump, 3 feet in diameter. It was what was left of a 150-year-old white oak. A tree Eleanor had named the Old General. A tree that had been a landmark on this land since before the Civil War. They had cut it down. They had cut down my tree on my land to improve their view. And now they were sending me a bill for the service. I stood there for a long time, my hand on the rough surface of the stump. The rings told the story of a century and a half of quiet, patient growth. For the first time in this whole affair, I felt a hot surge of anger. It was a violation that went deeper than property lines and legal documents. It was personal. But I let the anger cool, let it settle back into that cold, hard resolve. I went back inside, photographed the invoice and the stump, and filed them away. This was her last mistake, the final piece of evidence I needed, the bill for her own execution. The day of the grand opening arrived, bright and clear. The entire community was there, drawn by the promise of free food and a chance to see the inside of the building they'd been paying for. A small crew from the local news station had set up a camera. Brenda was in her element, preening and posing for pictures, accepting congratulations. She stood at a podium set up on the patio, the rolling hills of my land providing a scenic backdrop for her triumph. I had arrived early and stood quietly at the back of the crowd. I was wearing a simple tweed jacket and slacks. In my hand I carried a large, thick briefcase. Inside was the McAllister folder, now organized into a binder with index tabs, along with several copies of a summary packet my new lawyer and I had prepared. My lawyer, Mr. Davies, a sharp, no-nonsense man I'd retained 2 weeks prior, was standing with me. He was here as a witness. Brenda tapped the microphone. "Welcome, friends. Welcome, neighbors," she began, her voice ringing with false warmth. She gave a long, rambling speech about vision, community, and the tireless work of her board. She talked about overcoming obstacles and silencing the naysayers who lack faith in our shared future. She was looking right at me when she said it. Then came the main event. The ribbon, a wide satin affair, was stretched across the grand entrance. Brenda produced a pair of comically oversized golden scissors. The crowd applauded. The local news camera zoomed in. "I hereby declare the Lakeside Vistas Community Clubhouse officially open," she declared. With a dramatic flourish, she snipped the ribbon. The crowd cheered. Music started playing from hidden speakers. People began to surge towards the entrance, eager to see inside. This was my cue. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I simply began to walk forward, Mr. Davies at my side. My first stop was the news reporter, a young woman who was already directing her cameraman to get some B-roll of the crowd. "Excuse me," I said, handing her one of the summary packets. "My name is Arthur Vance. I'm the owner of the property this clubhouse has been built on. You're going to want to read this." Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page, a copy of my survey plat overlaid with the clubhouse blueprint. Her cameraman, sensing a story far better than a simple ribbon cutting, swung the camera back around and pointed it directly at us. Then I continued my walk, parting the crowd until I stood directly in front of Brenda McAllister. She was still holding the golden scissors, a triumphant smile on her face. The smile faltered when she saw me and the look in my eyes. "Arthur," she said, her voice tight, "this is a private event. You're not welcome here." "I believe I am," I said, my voice quiet but clear, carrying in the sudden lull of the crowd. "Seeing as it's my property." I held out a thick 9x12 envelope. Mr. Davies held out an identical one. "Brenda McAllister, as president of the Lakeside Vistas Homeowners Association, you are hereby served." Her hand trembled slightly as she took the envelope. She looked from me to Mr. Davies, then down at the papers. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. That, I said, is a formal complaint for trespass, ejectment, and damages. It includes a quiet title action to permanently and publicly affirm my ownership of this land, Parcel 7B. It also includes a demand for the immediate removal of this structure and the remediation of my property to its original state. Finally, it includes a separate tort claim for the intentional destruction of private property, namely, a 150-year-old white oak tree, for which we are seeking treble damages. I watched her face. It was like watching a statue crack in slow motion. The smug confidence, the performative authority, the sheer, unshakable self-belief. It all just crumbled. Her eyes scanned the top page, the certified survey plat. My name clearly printed as the owner. She looked up from the paper, her gaze sweeping over the grand clubhouse, the stone facade, the gleaming windows, the infinity pool. She looked at the crowd, which was now silent, watching her. She looked at the news camera, its red light glowing like a malevolent eye. And then she looked back at me. The mask didn't just drop, it shattered. For the first time I saw the person underneath. A small, frightened woman who had flown too close to the sun on wings of arrogance and was only now realizing she was falling. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The golden scissors slipped from her grasp and clattered onto the flagstone patio. The sound was unnaturally loud in the dead silence. She had no idea. But now she did. The legal proceedings were, as Mr. Davies had predicted, brutally efficient. Our case was not a matter of interpretation or argument. It was a matter of presenting a mountain of verifiable facts. Brenda and the HOA hired a law firm from the city, a flashy, expensive outfit that tried to argue everything from adverse possession to prescriptive easement. They were systematically dismantled by the contents of the McAllister folder. Their adverse possession claim collapsed when Mr. Davies presented the record of my paid fines. By paying even for trivial matters, I had repeatedly, if passively, asserted my role as the responsible party for the property, while simultaneously creating a paper trail. I had never abandoned the land. Their prescriptive easement claim fell apart when he produced the certified copy of the original easement agreement and its explicit termination clause. There was no open and notorious use, only a misreading of a 30-year-old document. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that my failure to halt construction sooner implied consent. Mr. Davies countered with the refused certified letter, the read receipt from the ignored email, and the Sheriff's Department incident report, where I had, on the record, declared them to be trespassing. I had not consented. I had warned. And they had willfully ignored me. The final nails in their coffin were George Henderson's audio recordings and Sarah's internal documents. The recording of Brenda saying, "It's better to build first and ask for forgiveness later," was played in open court. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for foolishness, listened to it with a look of profound disgust. The financial documents proved that Brenda had knowingly leveraged an asset, the clubhouse, that she had strong reason to believe was on disputed land, an act the judge later called a shocking display of fiduciary irresponsibility. The verdict was a complete and total victory. The court affirmed my undisputed ownership of Parcel 7B through the quiet title action. The HOA was found guilty of trespass and property destruction. They were ordered to pay for my legal fees, which were substantial. For the destruction of the Old General, the judge accepted the arborist's valuation of the historic tree and, citing the evidence of malice from the audio recording, awarded me the maximum of treble damages. The final judgment against the Lakeside Vistas HOA was for just over $1.2 million, not including the cost of what came next. The judge's order gave them 90 days to remove all structures and materials from the plaintiff's property and return said property to its original condition, to the plaintiff's satisfaction. They now had to pay to demolish the $3 million clubhouse they had just finished building. The fallout in the community was immediate and apocalyptic. Brenda was recalled as president in a fiery emergency meeting held in the high school gymnasium. I didn't attend, but George told me it was a spectacle of rage and recrimination. Homeowners who had been placidly paying their dues were now faced with a massive special assessment to cover the legal judgment and the demolition costs. Their HOA fees more than tripled overnight. Brenda McAllister, disgraced and ostracized, sold her house at a loss and moved away within 2 months. Sarah, the retired accountant, was elected as the new board president. Her first act was to commission a full audit of the HOA's finances and a review of every fine Brenda had ever levied. George Henderson received a check for several $1,000s, a refund for years of harassment over his shed and his sunflowers. The entire Book of Covenants was rewritten to be more reasonable, more humane. The reign of the RAL 9005 jet black mailbox was over. The demolition was a somber affair. The same crews who had built the clubhouse with such purpose now took it apart with a grim efficiency. I watched from my porch as it came down, piece by piece. The infinity pool was filled in. The flagstone patio was jackhammered into rubble. When they were finished, all that remained was a vast, ugly, concrete slab and acres of scarred earth where my meadow had been. The HOA paid a landscaping company to grade the soil and plant grass seed, but it would be years before it looked like itself again. It's been a year now. Life is quieter. Sarah runs the HOA with the boring, sensible competence of a good accountant. The neighbors who once viewed me as a strange recluse now wave when I drive past. George comes over for coffee sometimes. We sit on my porch and talk about birds. He has a new feeder, a bright red one, hanging in his yard, in plain view. I never sold them the land. Their lawyers made several desperate, exorbitant offers, but it was never about the money. It was about the principle. A line on a map is a promise. A deed is a covenant. My father understood that. Eleanor understood that. It was my duty to honor it. The concrete slab is still there. It's too big to remove without massive expense. I've been slowly breaking it up myself, a corner at a time with a sledgehammer and a pry bar. It's hard work, but it's satisfying. With each piece of concrete I haul away, it feels like I'm reclaiming something, more than just land. The McAllister folder sits on a shelf in my office. It's a testament not to anger, but to patience. A record of a quiet man's refusal to be bullied. Sometimes when I look at it, I think about the nature of things. About how some people like Brenda build their lives on loud assertions and the force of their own will, believing that if they say something is true, it becomes true. And how others, like me, trust in the quiet, unyielding power of the documented fact. In the end, the paper always wins. This morning I did something I've been meaning to do for a while. I took a small sapling, a young white oak, and I planted it in the soft earth a few yards from the old stump of the old general. It's small and fragile, but its roots are in good soil. My soil. I gave it some water and stood back, looking out over the healing meadow. It will be 100 years before it commands the view its predecessor did. I won't be here to see it, but it will be here, and it will grow undisturbed on the right side of the line. That's enough. That is everything.